They say knowledge is power, but that's not quite true, is it? Because if that were real, the world would belong to the wise, and it doesn't. The world belongs to those who move the wise, those who understand not just how people think, but what they'll do when they're afraid, flattered, or desperate. Machiavelli understood that better than anyone. And if he were alive today in this era of screens and illusions, he wouldn't be some old scholar writing letters to princes. He'd be the one writing the algorithms that decide what you see. He'd be whispering into your attention while you think you're scrolling freely. Because that's where power lives now, not in thrones or crowns, but in the silent control of what people believe they've chosen. Let's strip it down to its core. Machiavelli's real genius wasn't cruelty or cunning for its own sake, it was clarity. The brutal honesty to see the world without moral filters. Where others saw good and evil, he saw cause and effect. That's what makes him timeless. His 21 rules of power aren't rules in the traditional sense, they're observations about human nature that never stopped being true. The first truth he'd teach you is this: power hides behind virtue. The good man says he acts from principle, the powerful man acts from necessity. And he lets the world believe it's virtue. The difference is subtle but everything. Today, every corporation, every politician, every influencer is dressed in moral language. We care. We stand with, we believe. It's all a mask, and Machiavelli would smirk watching you applaud it, because he'd know the moment someone declares their virtue loudly, they're distracting you from their strategy. His rule would be simple: never declare your morality. Let others do that for you while you move in silence. Then comes his second rule: people don't want freedom, they want safety dressed as freedom. We like to imagine ourselves as independent thinkers, but most of what we do is driven by fear of loss, rejection, failure, isolation. Machiavelli would have seen today's world and understood instantly that fear is the new currency. Control fear and you control the herd. He'd say, don't waste time fighting fear, learn to direct it. When others panic, you guide their escape route and they'll follow you anywhere. And this leads to his third rule: the appearance of control is stronger than control. In the digital world, no one needs to have power if they can appear to. A confident voice, a viral clip, an air of certainty, that's all it takes. Machiavelli would call it the illusion of mastery. He'd say, people will trade their logic for your confidence. They'll believe you because they want someone to believe in. Rule their perceptions and you rule them even when you have nothing. But here's the thing about Machiavelli: he wasn't some dark prophet of manipulation. His writing wasn't about corruption. It was about survival. His world was one of betrayal, shifting alliances, and fragile thrones, not so different from ours, only our kingdoms are made of pixels. And so he'd remind you, loyalty is conditional, every alliance is temporary. Every friendship in the realm of power exists only as long as it serves both sides. The moment it doesn't, it dissolves, and pretending otherwise is self-destruction. The naive man calls this betrayal. The wise man calls it inevitability. To him, loyalty wasn't something you demanded, it was something you managed. Rule 5, never explain, results justify themselves. You can talk your way into weakness. The more you justify your choices, the more you reveal your insecurity. Machiavelli would watch people online defending themselves, explaining, clarifying, and he'd smile quietly, because every explanation lowers your status. He'd tell you if you must speak, do it to frame, not to explain. Let outcomes defend you. Silence is your shield, and that flows into his sixth rule: perception creates truth. It doesn't matter who's right, it matters who controls the story. The modern battlefield isn't the courtroom, it's the narrative, and the first one to define it wins. He'd remind you that in politics, in media, in business, there is no objective truth that survives unshaped. Truth is clay in the hands of those who can sculpt belief. But power doesn't come from constant movement. Machiavelli's seventh rule is the one few understand: withdraw strategically. He'd call it the power of absence. When you disappear, you create demand. Attention is oxygen, and if you're always available, you suffocate your own value. The powerful know when to vanish, when to let others wonder, when to let silence grow heavy. It's not mystery for its own sake, it's leverage. He'd tell you scarcity amplifies presence. The eighth rule follows naturally: be unpredictable enough to be feared, but consistent enough to be trusted. Machiavelli never advocated chaos. He understood that power requires stability, but not predictability. If people know your next move, you're vulnerable. If they never know whether you'll reward or punish, they'll stay cautious, and that's where control lives. You don't need to be loved or hated, you just need to be uncertain. Now here's one that most people miss: his ninth rule: don't compete where others expect you to. Shift the game. The powerful don't fight battles they can't control, they change the battlefield. If you're being attacked publicly, Machiavelli wouldn't tell you to defend yourself, he'd tell you to redirect attention, to open a new front that renders the old one irrelevant. The art of redirection is one of his deadliest tools. You don't resist pressure, you absorb it and convert it into motion. Then comes the 10th, charm is armor. Machiavelli understood that cruelty alone can't hold power. You need a lure, something magnetic that makes people want to forgive your ruthlessness. Today, that's charisma, humor, self-awareness. He'd call it the velvet glove around the iron fist. You never show both at once. Let people see your softness and they'll excuse your strategy. Here's the 11th, never act outraged. Outrage gives away your emotional balance. The man who shows anger admits he's been touched. Machiavelli would say the calm man frightens even when he smiles. Because calmness in the face of attack isn't peace, it's dominance. In a world addicted to emotional reaction, composure is the rarest display of power. And his 12th rule would tie that thread tighter: control your image like a weapon. Machiavelli would have thrived in the age of social media because he understood the art of presentation. Power isn't about being authentic, it's about being strategically authentic. Show flaws, but only the ones that make you relatable. Show strength, but only when it can't be challenged. Every post, every gesture, every silence, it's all performance. The weak perform to be liked, the powerful perform to be remembered, but power has a cost, and Machiavelli never hid that. His 13th rule: detach emotion from decision. Empathy can guide you, but it cannot rule you. If you hesitate out of guilt, you give your opponents time to strike. Machiavelli would tell you that morality is a luxury of those not in danger. In moments of crisis, the question is what's right. It's what keeps the structure standing. And if you must make a cruel choice, make it quickly and cleanly. Mercy loses meaning when it drags on. His 14th rule digs even deeper: use people's hope, not their logic. Hope blinds sharper than fear. Give people something to believe in, even a lie that comforts them, and they'll follow you with gratitude. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago, and nothing has changed. Every campaign, every movement, every influencer who thrives knows this. Logic rarely moves hearts, hope does. But hope alone is volatile. It lifts crowds, but it also blinds them. And that's why Machiavelli's 15th rule was always a mirror to the 14th. Feed hope, but never drink it yourself. The moment you start believing your own myth, you're lost. Power demands distance, not from people, but from the illusions they live by. He did tell you that leaders fall not because their enemies outsmart them, but because their followers seduce them. They start to think they deserve their power, that they're the chosen ones. That's when they become predictable, and predictability is death. Machiavelli would whisper, you must wear your own legend like armor, not skin, because skin bleeds. And then there's the 16th, control access to yourself like a scarce resource. The powerful never allow everyone to reach them. They let gates exist, physical, social, or psychological. The distance creates mystique. He did tell you that access equals exposure, and exposure erodes power. The more people can touch you, message you, or see you without earning it, the faster they stop valuing it. Machiavelli would look at today's endless self-disclosure, the constant need to be seen, and shake his head. Because he understood the paradox. When you give yourself to everyone, you belong to no one. The 17th rule: if you must destroy, destroy completely. Mercy is noble, but in Machiavelli's calculus, half measures breed revenge. Leave an enemy wounded and you create a lifelong adversary. End the threat entirely and you create silence. He'd remind you that cruelty, when used decisively, can be more merciful than endless conflict. The point was never to be cruel, it was to be final. He'd say, if you must cut, cut deep, then heal. Because the wound you leave unfinished will one day return to finish you. Now we come to something more subtle, the 18th rule: appear principled even when you're not. Machiavelli didn't advise immorality, he advised adaptability. People need to believe their leaders have values. It comforts them, so even when you act out of pragmatism, you must make it look like conviction. He did tell you that appearances aren't lies, they're instruments. A sword gleams not to deceive, but to signal its sharpness. He'd say, let the crowd believe you're guided by honor and you can act freely behind it. The 19th rule: power is theater. Every public act is a stage performance. The ruler, the CEO, the influencer, they're all actors in front of an audience that hungers not for truth, but for certainty. Machiavelli saw it centuries before television, before social media, before the illusion of transparency. The wise ruler, he said, must play the fox and the lion, cunning enough to deceive, strong enough to enforce. In today's world, he'd be both strategist and performer. Every gesture, every pause, every refusal to react, all part of the choreography. And yet there's a deeper layer. His 20th rule: never be too pure for strategy, because purity isolates you. You'll end up right, but irrelevant. Machiavelli's brilliance was his refusal to moralize reality. He looked at power like a physicist looks at gravity, not good or bad, just real. And he'd tell you, if you want to live effectively, stop demanding that the world be fair. Learn its rules, manipulate them if you must, but stop pretending you're above them. He'd say, you can curse the storm or you can learn to sail. And finally, his 21st rule, the crown jewel: the highest form of power is self-mastery, because all external power is borrowed. Influence, followers, authority, they all vanish when the world shifts. But the one thing that cannot be taken from you is your ability to govern yourself. Your emotions, your impulses, your reactions, that's the real battlefield. Machiavelli understood that before psychology existed, the man who cannot command himself will eventually be commanded by others. He'd say, "He who conquers his own fear needs no throne." And that's the part people always miss about him. They read The Prince and think he was glorifying manipulation. But what he was really saying was, understand human nature so you're not destroyed by it. Power isn't about domination, it's about protection. It's about seeing the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. Because when you see clearly, you stop being a pawn. You stop mistaking politeness for virtue, emotion for truth, comfort for safety. If Machiavelli lived today, he wouldn't wear a crown, he'd wear anonymity. He'd move like smoke between the cracks of influence. He'd know that visibility is vulnerability and that the most powerful person in the room is often the one no one notices until it's too late. He wouldn't argue online or posture. He'd study the crowd, understand the algorithm, and pull the strings invisibly. Because the modern prince doesn't need a palace, just a pulse on perception. He'd tell you control the frame and you control the fight. It's not about facts, it's about framing. The person who defines the context wins before the contest begins. Every debate, every rivalry, every movement is decided not by truth, but by who set the terms. If you define what something means, you don't need to prove that it's real. Machiavelli would thrive in this era of information warfare not by shouting louder, but by whispering first. He'd see social media as the new battlefield of egos, where people confuse visibility with influence, likes with loyalty, outrage with power. He'd watch the endless confessions, apologies, cancellations, and he'd recognize the same human patterns from the Renaissance courts. People rising fast, falling faster, thinking virtue would save them from strategy. He'd laugh quietly, not out of cruelty, but out of recognition, because nothing changes. The tools change, the faces change, but human nature, that stays eternal. He'd study your world and adapt instantly. He'd never defend himself publicly. He'd never explain his intentions. He'd never compete for attention. He'd let others fight for his approval. He'd build his power on information, not emotion. Every message you send, every fear you hide, every desire you reveal online, he'd collect them silently. Not to exploit, but to predict, because prediction is the purest form of control. And he'd remind you, you don't need to control people, just control what they respond to. That's the secret. You don't fight the human mind, you guide it. Show people what to love, what to fear, what to laugh at, and they'll do the rest themselves. Power today isn't about authority. It's about influence disguised as choice. The illusion of freedom maintained by constant stimulation. And Machiavelli, centuries ago, already saw it coming. He'd see leaders who rule by outrage, companies that weaponize empathy, ideologies that promise salvation but deliver obedience, and he'd recognize them all as masters of the same game, the game of managing perception. And if you asked him what his advice would be to you, the individual trying to survive this modern empire of manipulation, he'd tell you something brutally simple: don't be naive. He'd say, learn to see motives beneath manners, learn to hear the intention behind the words, learn to stand still while others react. Because the modern battlefield isn't fought with swords or armies, it's fought with attention. Every outrage, every argument, every distraction is a theft of focus. Machiavelli would tell you, guard your attention as if it were gold, because it is. Every click, every glance, every emotional reaction feeds someone else's empire. He'd teach you that the art of power in the 21st century is the art of selective blindness, knowing when not to respond, when to appear unaware while you calculate, when to let others waste their energy proving themselves while you conserve yours. The calm observer always wins in the long run because emotion burns quickly. Strategy endures, and if you internalize that, something shifts. You stop seeking approval, you stop needing validation, you start moving differently, slower, quieter, more deliberate. You begin to see through people's performances, their borrowed outrage, their curated virtue. You stop being pulled into their storms. That's what Machiavelli meant by mastery, not manipulation of others, but control over your own internal empire. He'd say, power does corrupt, weakness does. Because weakness makes you lie, posture, perform. Power just reveals who you already were. And that's where his philosophy transforms from cold calculation into something deeper. Because when you stop trying to be seen as powerful and start understanding power, you become untouchable in a different way. You stop being swayed by emotion or appearances. You learn to act, not react. You learn to calculate without cruelty, to observe without fear. That's the real secret Machiavelli left behind. His 21 rules weren't blueprints for tyranny. They were a mirror for humanity, a guide to seeing clearly in a world built on illusion. And if you can look through that mirror without flinching, if you can see manipulation without becoming manipulative, deceit without becoming deceitful, then you've transcended the very game he described. Because the final truth he'd leave you with is this: the only person who can't be outsmarted is the one who no longer needs to win. But here's the thing no one wants to admit: Every one of us plays the game, whether we know it or not. The question isn't if you're Machiavellian, it's how consciously you are. Power isn't reserved for kings and CEOs, it's in families, friendships, relationships, every small negotiation of life. When you hold back a truth to keep the peace, when you smile at someone you secretly distrust, when you pretend not to notice something because it serves you better, you're playing his game. You might call it survival. Machiavelli would call it wisdom. He'd say, don't feel guilty for being strategic, feel guilty for being blind. Because pretending to live outside power doesn't free you from it, it just makes you prey to those who don't pretend. The moment you step into the world, you've already entered the arena. And the arena doesn't care about your intentions, it cares about your awareness. That's the paradox of modern morality. Everyone condemns manipulation while practicing it in subtler ways. The influencer curates authenticity. The politician weaponizes empathy. The idealist markets outrage. Everyone wants to look good while winning. But Machiavelli stripped that illusion bare. He'd tell you you don't have to be pure, you just have to be effective. And yet effectiveness without conscience is hollow. That's the piece people miss. Machiavelli wasn't asking you to abandon ethics. He was asking you to understand context. He knew that life forces you to make choices between bad and worse, between peace and weakness, between justice and survival. He wasn't advocating evil. He was preparing you for complexity, because the world doesn't punish evil nearly as harshly as it punishes naivety. And that's what he feared most, the person who believes good intentions protect them. The naive man is eaten first because he never sees the jaws closing. He'd say, learn to look at people as they are, not as you wish they were. And that lesson, once you truly absorb it, changes how you move forever. You stop being shocked by betrayal, stop expecting fairness, stop demanding purity from an impure world. You start working with reality, not against it. And that shift, that's the first real taste of freedom. Freedom isn't doing whatever you want. It's understanding the consequences so clearly that your choices are deliberate. That's the kind of freedom Machiavelli respected, the freedom of the strategist, not the dreamer. But what this really means is that power isn't about dominance, it's about clarity, seeing without distortion, acting without hesitation, choosing without self-deception. He'd tell you to lead others, you must first stop lying to yourself. Because the mind lies constantly. It flatters, excuses, rationalizes. It tells you that you're noble, that you're different, that your motives are pure. But Machiavelli would laugh at that. He'd say, every man justifies what benefits him. And once you see that, once you stop believing your own excuses, you become frighteningly clear. You start moving through the world with eyes open. That's the stage where real transformation begins, when you no longer cling to comforting illusions. You see manipulation and recognize it not as evil, but as part of the architecture of interaction. You start to notice patterns, how people use vulnerability as leverage, how apologies can reset hierarchies, how silence can command more than words. You realize that morality itself is often a weapon used by those who can't win through merit. But this clarity comes with loneliness. Because once you start seeing clearly, innocence dies. The world looks colder, but also more honest. You understand that no one is purely good or evil, just driven by fear, ego, survival, or love. You see that empathy isn't weakness, but information, that forgiveness isn't virtue, but strategy. Machiavelli would warn you, once you see the gears behind the curtain, you can't unsee them, so use that vision wisely. He'd tell you that the greatest mistake of modern man is confusing kindness with goodness. Kindness is behavior, goodness is motive. You can smile while betraying someone, you can flatter while plotting, you can donate millions while manipulating the narrative. The appearance of virtue has never been more powerful or more dangerous. He'd tell you to cultivate empathy not for morality's sake, but for precision. The more you understand what moves people, their fears, their insecurities, their desires, the more you can anticipate them. That's not cruelty, that's competence. To navigate human nature, you must map it first. But then he'd say something few expect, never let power consume your humanity. Because once you lose the ability to feel, you become predictable. The man who cannot be touched by emotion loses the ability to connect, and connection is leverage. Machiavelli wasn't inhuman. He was realistic. He knew that coldness is useful, but isolation is fatal. You can't rule what you don't understand, and you can't understand what you don't feel. That's the subtle balance of his philosophy: control without detachment, compassion without naivete. To lead, you must sometimes wound. To survive, you must sometimes deceive, but you never lose sight of why you're doing it. The goal isn't to dominate, it's to endure. He'd look at today's chaos, the constant outrage, the wars of attention, the endless hunger for validation, and he'd see a civilization that's lost its discipline. People react before they think. They trade conviction for applause. They confuse emotional intensity with moral depth. And he'd whisper, whoever can stay calm will inherit this world. because calm is power, stillness is power, observation is power. The loudest person is rarely the strongest, they're just the most afraid. The calm one is dangerous because he's not ruled by impulse. He watches, measures, and acts when it matters. That's what Machiavelli meant by control, not domination, but timing. He'd tell you the wise don't rush to act, they wait until the act cannot fail. In a world addicted to speed, patience has become the ultimate weapon. Everyone else is sprinting toward visibility, chasing attention, reacting to noise. The one who pauses, thinks, watches, calculates, that one becomes untouchable. You see, all 21 rules point toward one truth. Power is awareness, not fame, not wealth, not fear, awareness, because awareness makes manipulation impossible. When you see the mechanism, you're no longer inside it. You become the observer, the one who moves when others freeze. The one who sees through praise, through flattery, through illusion. Awareness makes you sovereign, but awareness without direction is paralysis. That's why Machiavelli's final lesson would be, use your awareness to create, not just defend. Build something, shape something. Power is sterile if it serves only itself. The strategist must eventually become the builder, because the highest expression of power isn't control, it's creation. He'd tell you that the true prince, the one who outlasts chaos, is the one who can turn vision into structure. Not through inspiration alone, but through understanding the limits of human nature and designing around them. That's what leadership really means, engineering order out of predictable flaws. And yet he'd smile knowingly because he'd understand the ultimate irony. The most powerful person in the world will never be known by name. The one who influences without being seen, who shapes events from the shadows, who moves entire systems through subtle shifts in perception. That's the modern Machiavellian. No spotlight, no stage, just control through invisibility. But he'd also warn you that kind of power demands discipline. The moment you crave recognition, you give it all back, because visibility is a trap. Once they can see you, they can measure you. Once they can measure you, they can predict you. And once they can predict you, they can control you. The invisible player, the silent strategist, he's the last free man. So what does that mean for you, the listener, standing in this world of noise and endless persuasion? It means you must decide what kind of power you want. The kind that looks strong or the kind that is strong, the kind that screams or the kind that endures. Machiavelli would tell you to start with the self, master your impulses, your speech, your need to prove. Because every word you throw in defense of your ego is a brick taken from your own fortress. He'd remind you that in a society where everyone's shouting, silence itself becomes authority. The man who doesn't explain, who doesn't react, who doesn't beg to be understood, that man becomes an enigma. And enigmas are never powerless. So if you want to live as Machiavelli would today, not as a manipulator, but as a master of your own mind, start by practicing stillness. Speak less, observe more. Watch how quickly people reveal themselves when you don't rush to fill the silence. Learn what moves them, learn what stops them, then learn what moves you. Because at the end of everything, beyond all the tactics, the rules, the strategies, there's one battlefield left, the war between who you are and who the world wants you to be. Machiavelli's greatest rule wasn't written in The Prince. It was written between the lines. Become untouchable by understanding yourself completely. When you do that, manipulation stops working on you, flattery stops controlling you, fear stops steering you. You see through the tricks, the noise, the false virtue. You stop fighting for the illusion of control because you already have the real thing. And when that happens, something incredible follows. You no longer need to outsmart everyone because you've already outgrown the game. But here's the truth that unsettles most people. Every game of power ends the same way. Not with victory, not with defeat, but with exhaustion. You climb, you maneuver, you outthink, you outlast. And then one day you look down and realize you've built a throne out of fear. You've become the thing you once tried to protect yourself from. That's the hidden cost Machiavelli understood too well. Power without reflection eventually eats the soul that sought it. He saw it in the princes of Florence, in the popes, in the generals who ruled like gods until the moment they were betrayed by the very people who crowned them. He knew that dominance is a cycle. The powerful are adored, then envied, then replaced. That's why his truest lesson wasn't about how to rise, but how not to fall. How to stay awake while everyone else sleeps inside their own illusions. If he were alive now, he'd look around and see the same story, only modernized. Politicians preaching morality while buying silence. Influencers selling authenticity by the ounce. Billionaires pretending to be saviors. And underneath it all, the same machinery of fear, envy, and control ticking like clockwork. He wouldn't be shocked. He'd just whisper, "This is how it's always been, only the masks have changed." He'd tell you that every age believes it's morally superior to the one before it. Every generation thinks it's more enlightened, more self-aware, more just. But the game never changes, only the costumes do. The kings wear sneakers now, the courts are online, the throne is a feed and the subjects are scrolling, but the dynamics identical. That's why if you truly want to outsmart everyone, you must stop seeing history as something that happened and start seeing it as something that's still happening. Machiavelli's principles weren't frozen in time, they were blueprints for awareness. Each one a mirror for you to look at yourself and ask, where do I give my power away? Who controls my fear? Who defines my virtue? He'd remind you that power is never taken, it's given, willingly, out of fear, admiration, laziness, or love. We hand it over every time we let someone else define our worth, our values, our direction. That's why his philosophy at its core wasn't about control over others, it was a demand for self-possession. Think about it. The person who can't be flattered, who can't be shamed, who can't be provoked, that person is untouchable. Not because they dominate others, but because they own themselves completely. You can't manipulate someone who doesn't need validation. You can't threaten someone who's made peace with loss. You can't seduce someone who's seen the hollowness behind the spotlight. That's what Machiavelli meant by mastery. It's not about becoming feared, it's about becoming free. He'd tell you most people don't want power, they want comfort dressed as power. They don't want the solitude, the vigilance, the responsibility that comes with real sovereignty. They want applause, they want to feel in control without ever taking the risks that real control demands. But power, real power, is lonely. It requires distance from the noise, and that distance feels like exile to the weak. He'd say, to lead yourself, you must learn to be alone without being lonely. Because solitude is where clarity grows. In silence, you see what others miss. You begin to hear the subtle manipulations that fill the air, the emotional bait, the outrage cycles, the moral traps. You realize that most of what people call virtue is just strategy, and most of what they call evil is just necessity. And from that understanding comes something stronger than dominance, serenity. That's the paradox of Machiavelli's philosophy. It begins in control, but ends in peace. Because once you see how power truly operates, the urge to chase it dissolves. You don't need to prove, persuade, or perform anymore. You start acting from understanding, not ego. You stop mistaking chaos for opportunity. You begin to move like water, flowing, adaptable, unstoppable. He'd say, be like the tide, calm, inevitable, beyond blame. The tide doesn't justify itself, it doesn't explain, it just moves with absolute certainty. And that's how the truly powerful live. Not through aggression, but through inevitability. They don't fight every battle, they choose the terrain where victory is guaranteed. They don't speak often, when they do it carries weight. They don't need to announce their presence announces itself. And yet the ultimate lesson Machiavelli would leave you with isn't about tactics at all, it's about truth. The ability to see truth no matter how uncomfortable it is. The courage to face the darker parts of yourself without judgment. Because the mind that refuses to see its own corruption will project it onto everyone else. The moment you think, I'm not like them, you've already lost awareness. He'd tell you you can only master others after you've mastered your own shadow. That's why every tyrant eventually collapses, not because they were overthrown, but because they were consumed by the very impulses they refused to acknowledge. Greed, fear, vanity. Power without self-knowledge turns inward and devours itself. So Machiavelli's wisdom, stripped to its essence, isn't a guide for manipulation, it's a mirror for evolution. It asks you to look at the machinery of human behavior and not turn away. To see the cowardice behind virtue, the strategy behind love, the self-interest behind generosity, and still choose to act consciously. To operate with open eyes, not closed ideals. Because when you see clearly, compassion becomes sharper. You stop resenting weakness because you recognize it in yourself. You stop worshiping strength because you see how fragile it is. You start understanding that every human being is playing the same game, just with different stakes. And that understanding, that vision beyond good and evil, is the beginning of wisdom. He'd say, the highest power is not to win but to understand. Because understanding makes you untouchable. You stop being moved by manipulation because you see it as a pattern, not a threat. You stop fearing loss because you know everything you have is temporary. You stop chasing approval because you know every crowd eventually turns. You start choosing your words, your alliances, your silences with surgical precision. And in that stillness, something rare happens. You feel free, not the freedom of rebellion, but the freedom of comprehension, the freedom that comes when the illusions finally drop away. You don't need to fight the game because you've learned to stand outside of it. That's what Machiavelli's philosophy becomes in the modern world, not a manual for dominance, but a path to lucidity, to see, to understand, to move without delusion. Because power in the 21st century isn't about ruling nations. It's about ruling narratives, emotions, perceptions, and the only way to survive that storm is to stop being ruled by your own. He'd tell you that in the end, the greatest ruler isn't the one who commands armies, but the one who commands attention without craving it, the one who leads by understanding rather than convincing, the one who remains calm in the flood of noise. Because calmness is the final flex of power, it terrifies the chaotic. It unsettles the manipulative, it disarms the violent, and when you live like that calm, deliberate, aware, you don't need to win arguments or prove your worth. Your presence alone becomes authority. People feel it without knowing why. They start to self-correct in your silence. That's the invisible empire Machiavelli was pointing toward, not thrones or palaces, but a mind so disciplined it bends the world around it. He'd say power isn't something you hold, it's something you are. It's the alignment between thought and action, between awareness and restraint. It's the quiet knowledge that you could destroy but choose not to. It's the self-control that makes chaos bow. And that kind of power, the internal kind, can't be taken, stolen, or overthrown. It doesn't depend on others. It lives in how you carry yourself when no one's watching. And so, as the noise of the world keeps growing, remember this: the most Machiavellian thing you can do today isn't manipulation. It's mastery, the mastery of your reactions, your focus, your desires, the mastery of when to speak and when to disappear, the mastery of knowing that every emotion you let rule you is a hand pulling your strings. Machiavelli would tell you to cut those strings not with anger but with understanding. Because once you understand how the world works, you no longer need to resist it. You move through it like a ghost, unseen but everywhere. You stop chasing crowns and start building thrones within. That's the final paradox. The man history called ruthless was in truth a liberator. He freed people from illusions. He taught them that morality without strategy is impotence, and strategy without morality is suicide. He gave the world a lens to see itself without filters, brutal, yes, but honest. And if you can face that honesty without flinching, you step into a power far greater than manipulation. The power to see clearly, the power to remain still, the power to act without illusion. That's what it means to outsmart everyone, not to control them, but to never again be controlled by them. And that's the quiet victory Machiavelli would have wanted for you. Not domination, not fame, just mastery, calm, invisible, absolute. Because in the end, every throne crumbles, every empire fades, every ruler is forgot. But the man who mastered himself, he never loses anything. He carries his kingdom within, and that, Machiavelli would say with a faint smile, is the only kind of power worth having.